This afternoon I'm here with Bret W, who is a professor of philosophy, Eastern thought and comparative philosophy, or transcultural philosophy, or intercultural philosophy at Loyola University in Maryland. You do work on continental philosophy, phenomenology, Heidegger in particular, but you're also an expert on Zen Buddhism and the Kyoto School. So I'm delighted to be here with you. Can you tell us something about yourself, Bret?
Yes, thank you for inviting me. First of all, it's very nice to be here with you. What else can I say about myself? So you're right, I'm a professor at philosophy at Loyola University Maryland, and I teach a lot of classes, introduction to Asian philosophy as well as introduction to Western philosophy, and then seminars in things like Japanese philosophy, Chinese philosophy, Buddhist philosophy.
Yeah. Well, I want to begin by thanking you for accepting my invitation and joining us for the day. We spent a wonderful lunch going over some interesting issues about how to do philosophy in a non-Eurocentric way. And this afternoon, you will be giving a beautiful lecture on a possible dialogue between Western ways of thinking and Japanese ways of thinking about the relationship between nature and freedom. But I would like to begin with a personal question. I know that you are a practitioner of Zen Buddhism, and you have immersed yourself in Japanese philosophy. What motivated you to give yourself over to this complicated, demanding, way of thinking, but also require a lot of time learning the languages?
Yes, the motivation. Yeah, I first went to Japan when I was 22, 23 years old. And I ended up spending most of my 20s and 30s in Japan. So I spent many years there learning the language and culture, but also studying the philosophy, and as you mentioned, practicing Zen Buddhism. So why? You're asking why did I do that? Looking back, I think that my motivations were both. I think I could say I had an intrinsic motivation, intrinsic interest, and then also another interest that is a bit more extrinsic. The intrinsic interest was in college. I studied not just Western philosophies and religions, but also Eastern philosophies and religions, and I was fascinated by these, and especially drawn to Buddhism and Zen Buddhism in particular, also Taoism and East Asian thought. And I knew that if I really wanted to understand these from the inside, that I needed to go there and live in that context and learn the language and do the practice. So I had sort of this intrinsic interest in these ways of thinking and ways of experiencing, ways of living, really. But at the same time, I had another motivation, which came out of the work I was doing in philosophy in college. And in college, I was learning about, what we call the linguistic turn in philosophy on both sides of the Atlantic, right? So what we call continental philosophy as well as analytic philosophy. Language, in the 20th century became really important. And also a recognition, I think, of maybe more so in continental philosophy, of the importance of tradition, history, culture, and the ways in which these, together with language, shape our experience of the world and our patterns of thinking. And so it sort of dawned on me that if we are really going, as philosophers, philosophy students and included, are going to really take language seriously and are really going to take culture and tradition and so forth seriously, and really take sort of different phenomenological modes of experiencing the world seriously, then wouldn't it be meaningful to immerse oneself in as different a culture as possible, as different a language as possible? So I think those two motivations kind of joined together, that it was both the utter sort of difference from Western languages, cultures, and so forth. That was part of the motivation that sort of added to the more powerful kind of intrinsic motivation I had to learn these ways of thinking and practicing and experiencing.
You just mentioned that you're also studied Zen Buddhism, but you also practice it. What does this mean for your philosophical vocation? Does it impact the way you philosophize?
That is a very important and therefore difficult question. but it's a very, obviously it's a very important question. Yes, first of all, yes, it does impact. How to talk about that is a little bit more difficult, because it's not as if you're, memorizing a certain dogmatic teaching that then becomes something that you believe in or something like that. It's not that at all. So what is it then? What happens when you practice motivation? How does this affect your philosophical thinking, as you said? Let me maybe approach that question by way of talking about something that really interests me in philosophy and in the tradition of phenomenology in particular. I was really sort of grabbed in my study of Western philosophy, continental philosophy, phenomenology in particular, grabbed by this idea that our very attitude towards the world, our very approach, what Husserl calls the Einstellung. There's different attitudes that open up the world in different ways. Mm-hmm. In other words, that the things are allowed to show themselves to us differently depending on how we approach them. But an even maybe better way to talk about it is the way, to use Heidegger's language, of a fundamental attunement, or Grundstimmung, that all of our sort of thought is conditioned by the way in which our attitude or our attunement, the attunement's a very good word, because it's not just subject going outward, but it's an attunement between us and the rest of phenomena in the world. And so I think that for me, one of the really important things that philosophers do is not just work on the rigor of logical arguments. It's not even just work on the hermeneutics of learning about traditions and concepts and where thoughts and ideas come from, but it's also the kind of phenomenological work of taking a step back, a Schritt zurück, as Heidegger would call it, to try to get at the very original opening of ourselves to the world, of ourselves in the world, that allows things to show themselves in this or that way. So for Heidegger, increasingly it becomes the will is the problem, right? The will is this human willfulness allows the world only to show itself in a certain way. We objectify things and so forth. So what would a different attitude be like? One of Gelassenheit in Heidegger's terminology. So I think that if we come back to your question about what does Zen meditation add to, or how does it alter one's philosophizing, I think it would be at that level, at the most kind of basic level at which we experience the world, which then conditions all of our thoughts about it.
As you know, one of the key phrases for Western philosophy goes back to something that Socrates pretty much called us to do, and that is to know oneself, to know thyself. And this seems to be a kind of foregrounding of the subject, which seems to be very different from what you find in Zen Buddhism, which would be a letting be, a releasement, a Gelassenheit of the subject, in which you step back from yourself. So how do you see the relationship between this fundamental Western mode of thinking about ourselves and suspending this reflection on the subject?
Yes, that's a very another great question. So you're certainly right about there being both maybe a connection and a difference between the Socratic philosophical motivation of gnothi seauton, or know thyself, and what's going on in something like the practice of Zen Buddhism. Interestingly, one of the ways in which Zen Buddhism has defined itself and its practice is, as the Zen master Daito Kokushi calls it, koji-kyume, which means an investigation into the self. So there's this really sort of wonderful parallel between know thyself and investigation into the self. But I think there's also important differences. So what happens when one really comes to know oneself? There's another very famous text of the Zen tradition Dogen, 13th century Zen master, Japanese Zen master, says that to study the Buddha way, to study Buddhism as we would call it, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. But then he says, and here we come to your point, I think, the next line he says, to study the self is to forget the self. And then he goes on to finish and says, to forget the self is to be enlightened by the myriad things of the world. In other words, to study the Buddha way is to study the self, but to study the self is to open the self to the world.
That's beautiful. So you just made it evident that you know very well Japanese as well as German and English, and you have written and published in both languages. What is the relationship between language and thinking, if not to use the word language and philosophy, but language and thought?
Yes, of course. Yeah, this has to do with the first, thing I was saying about the linguistic turn and the very sort of important role that language has come to play in I think all of recent currents in philosophy. It's maybe not an exaggeration to say that. And I agree with the stress on language, but I think it does get taken too far at some points when people think in terms of a kind of determinism, that language strictly determines our thought. One of the problems of this is that then leads to a kind of linguistic relativism, where we're each caught inside the bubble of our own language. Right, a language, the limits of my language are the limits of my world, as Wittgenstein says, or as Heidegger says, right, that language is the house of being. And then Heidegger worries that the East Asians, since their language is so different, they must dwell, as he says, in a completely different house of being. And so I think that there's both a really important point being made here, but also a kind of danger of just saying, okay, well, we can't have any kind of cross-cultural dialogue because we're all just caught up in our own language bubbles. And so I think to take really seriously the way in which thought happens in and through language, our experience of the world happens in and through language. And yet, I think it's a two-way street. So I think that our experience both reforms our language just as our language informs our experience. And that becomes really important when one does cross-cultural philosophy, because that opens the door to the possibility of inhabiting a different house of being, as Heidegger would put it. I mean, how is it the case that people can learn foreign languages and not just learn to translate them or not just learn to appreciate them from the outside, but really to inhabit them and to live in them, to live through them? I think that can only happen because we're not, in fact, completely determined by a fixed language. I think language itself is not fixed and closed, but there's always this sort of interplay between experience, thought, and language.
If I were to use the language of everyday life, we live in a globalized world in which English has become a lingua franca. And there is really no need, not only because of the internet, but because of the prevalence of English, to learn another language. Is there an ethical duty to learn another language?
I think yes. That there's an ethical duty. There's a political importance of learning other languages, because after all, if, as we've just said, if language really largely shapes the way people think and experience the world, and it's also, maybe we can say, it's an expression of people's thought and feelings and values about the world, then to not learn other people's languages is to not try to understand them, to not let them be, so to speak, to not enter into dialogue with them. And so I think there is a kind of ethical imperative and political importance for learning other languages, for not just having everyone learn your language and then only operating in that medium. But I would also stress especially as a philosopher, I would stress that it's important to learn other languages, not only out of an ethical and political concern for recognizing and appreciating the alterity of other people who live in other languages and other cultures, but also the incredible richness of the various languages and cultures there are in the world, is that we're doing our own philosophical thinking a disservice if we don't learn to appreciate and to let contribute to our own thinking thoughts that and ideas that are formed in other languages.
Yeah.
Part of that will be what I'll be doing this afternoon in my lecture.
Right. Let me now refer to the lecture that you will be presenting later on. In this wonderful, beautiful lecture, you make a distinction between nature and world. And I wonder if you can explain what the difference is in the world, nature, is in nature, what is the ground of the world? And so can you explain how you make this distinction? And then how does this distinction relate or compare to the other terms that we have in language, such as environment, planet, earth, biosphere, ecosystem, or environment, or we have a plurality of words to refer to the world.
Yes.
So
yes, it's true, isn't it? We have, and that's a good point that also relates to your last point about your last question about language. Even our own language, right? We don't have to look to other languages to see how the language, the words that we use, are shaping the way we think those thoughts. So if there's one thing that we're calling by these different names, world, nature, environment, ecosphere, and so on and so forth, cosmos, universe, etc. What difference does it make when we use those different words? And I think one of the things that philosophers are charged with doing, especially in their hermeneutical mode, is really uncovering and presenting before us how those words are shaping how we understand the phenomenon that we're speaking about. So, for example, environment, right, means an encircling, Umwelt in German, right, a world that encircles one. Mm-hmm. So there's actually sort of a tension between many people who are doing environmental philosophy, who want to talk about a non-anthropocentric environmental philosophy, when the very word environment is anthropocentric, is talking about an Umwelt, a world that circles around the center point that is the human subject. So I think that these different words can really color and shape the phenomenon very differently. Your original question about what's the difference between world and nature, I think, of course, it depends on the discourse of who's using those words. I think world has come to mean, especially for someone who reads, Heidegger, for example, has come to mean, what he would call a kind of totality of significance, a meaningful world. In other words, world is a human world, whereas nature gestures towards an excess, some excess, as you put it, is nature perhaps the ground of world? Mm-hmm. Ground, earth, these different terms they're words in language that try to gesture, I think, towards something that both exceeds and yet also supports our worlds of meaning. So that might be one approach to responding to that question of yours.
In your lecture, you also, this is one of the key claims or propositions of your text, of your lecture, is that when we look at a Japanese thought, there we might find something like a non-antagonistic way of thinking about the relationship between nature and freedom. Whereas in Western philosophy and Western thought, we think of freedom as the opposite of nature. Like nature conditions us, and therefore we're not free. To be free is in some way to depart nature, to leave the state of nature, to ascend to something like freedom. And so you think that we can find a non-antagonistic way of thinking about these two terms. But I wonder if we can really reconcile them, because the temporality of nature is one of process, of cycles, whereas the temporality of freedom is one of development. We're not born free, we become free. We make ourselves free through our social relations. And so I wonder whether we can reconcile these two different temporalities.
The temporality of human freedom and the temporality of nature.
Yes.
Yes. I think in a way, though, that is rephrasing the question that I'm trying to address in the lecture. Because although you began asking the question by pointing out how in my lecture I tried to show how we don't have to think of these as antagonistic, I think that in the end you circle back to, again, sort of reiterating a more, if not antagonistic, at least a kind of irreconcilable relation. But I think what I'm trying to do in the lecture, though, is suggest, maybe we can rethink freedom in such a way, and maybe even the temporality of freedom. I think you're raising a new way of approaching this for me that will be fruitful for me to take from this interview and think more about. But maybe even the temporality of human freedom is not something that's simply irreconcilable with or at odds with the temporality of nature. But I think that is really going to require rethinking what we mean by freedom, what we mean by nature. I'm reminded of what Merleau-Ponty has to say about this issue, because one of the things he really interestingly does that neither Husserl nor Heidegger before him did was to really bring in the temporalities of nature, the temporalities of the body, for example. And he both sort of juxtaposed, but then also talked about how that's intertwined with the temporalities of human meaning formation and so forth. So I think he might be an interesting source for us to go back to that might, be a kind of bridge to some of the Japanese thought that I'll be discussing, of how we might rethink the temporality of nature and the temporality of human existence as not something that is on the distant horizon of something we can one day achieve, but is what is happening right here and right now in our embodiment all the time, is that intertwinement of natural time and human time.
Yeah. Let me ask the same question, but from a different perspective. One of the things that we might say about our present ecological crisis, or what has been called the Anthropocene, is that it is the result of too much attention on freedom. And so perhaps the opposition is not nature freedom, but I don't know, that the fact that humans are the creatures who are always coming to the world, who are vulnerable, who are exposed, whose fundamental of being in the world is precisely exposure. And that exposure is the presupposition of becoming free. It is because we are finite and vulnerable that we could be free, but with others. And to be vulnerable, to be codependent, to be in relations of dependency, that seems to talk about freedom in a different way. Freedom as disavowed dependence. And so maybe the gesture of talking about nature freedom is the one that got us in the problem, the situation that we find ourselves. I mean, that's a contentious question, but I wonder what you would say.
Yes, and again, I think I agree with you as long as we stick with accustomed understandings and definitions of nature and freedom. So one approach, if we recognize this problem, as you put it, that maybe it's too much attention to freedom that got us into these problems in the first place. So one approach is, well, maybe we need to de-emphasize human freedom. But another approach, and this is the approach that I'm taking, is that maybe we need to rethink what human freedom really is, right? So that maybe human freedom doesn't need to, and it's in fact not best defined in terms of a kind of independence and control over an external nature.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe real freedom is found in the midst of relationships instead of in independence from relationships. Maybe it's found in the midst of naturalness as opposed to being something supernatural, and so forth.
Mm. That's a very thoughtful response. Thank you. I would like us to return to the beginning of our conversation on the relationship between language and thought, or language and thinking. And in Zen Buddhism, there's a tool, a figure, the koan. And so you're very knowledgeable of koans. And I wonder if there's one that is has an ethical message, one that you always go back to. And what would that koan be? And can you explain for us its ethical import?
So you saved the hardest question for last, I see. One of the reasons why it's a difficult question is because the discourse of the koan and the way that discourse is used, and the discourse of philosophy, or the discourse of an interview, a philosophical interview, such as this one, are really different discourses, really different ways in which language is being used, ways in which people are interacting. Let me sort of say something brief about that, and then I'll try to in the meantime, I'll be trying to think of a koan that would respond to your question. In the use of koans in Zen, the point is not to explain something. The point is not to make an argument. The person who's using a koan in their practice, it's assumed that that person already understands the explanations that are given in the many, many Buddhist discourses. It already assumes that they understand the philosophical arguments that support, this or that idea in Buddhism. The point of the koan is to try to bring that intellectual understanding down to the level of direct, life-changing, experiential understanding. So it's a level difference as opposed to, it's going to be a different type of secret discourse or something like that. That's not the point. So I think it's important to sort of bear that in mind, because anytime we take koans out of that context in which they are at home in the way that they're used, and bring them into a philosophical discussion, we just need to recognize that that's what we're doing when we do that. So with that in mind, maybe in the present context, I would have to refer to one of the most famous and infamously intricate and difficult and hard to pass. It's usually recognized one of the nanto, or the hard to pass koans. Even though it appears quite early, although this is not unusual in Zen that the early ones are the really hard ones in some cases. But the second koan in the famous collection, the Mumon Kan, or the Gateless Barrier collection, is called the Fox Koan. And the Fox Koan, it tells a kind of story. It's a story of an abbot of a Zen monastery who was condemned to live 500 years as a wild fox because he answered a question wrong. And the question was whether an enlightened person falls into or is subject to cause and effect. And he said no. And that condemned him to 500 years as a wild fox. And then finally, he asks another Zen master, Hyakujo. He says, this is what happened to me. How should I have answered that question? And Hyakujo says, not obscuring cause and effect. And then that liberated him from his fox body. So the way this koan is used is very, very difficult, and there's many things. So let me just sort of say in the present context that I think what we can learn from that is freedom. In other words, freedom from cause and effect, that we're not condemned to a kind of deterministic living out the karmic outcomes of our previous actions and so forth. That freedom, in that sense, is not found by transcending, by being somehow outside, as if the Zen master no longer has to abide by the rules of the world or something like that. That's the mistake. That really the not falling or not being subject to cause and effect is found right in the midst of the nitty-gritty of being utterly aware and attuned to and investigating cause and effect. And so for here, maybe I would relate that to our talking about freedom in nature, and that freedom is not freedom from nature and all of its regularity and all of its surprises, but freedom is only found by returning right in the midst of the world of nature and of society.
Thank you so much for our conversation, and I look forward to hearing the lecture this afternoon.
Thank you very much.